It was December 9th, 2019, when a decision was made that would change everything. In an inconspicuous house in snowy Bismarck, North Dakota, two people sat together, bound by a secret darker than the long winter night outside. They were not lovers in the traditional sense, not heroes, not victims. They were a woman with a plan and a man willing to kill for her. Nikki Ensel was 38 years old, a wife and mother of two children, outwardly friendly, well-known in the community, polite and committed, but behind the facade, discontent was brewing. Her marriage to Chad Ensel, a quiet, reliable man, had long since grown cold. He worked in the energy sector, loved bowling, and rarely took center stage. Nikki, on the other hand, was looking for more attention, adventure, and a way out. She found that way out in Earl Howard, a man with a dubious past. The two met during an online training course. What began as a casual flirtation soon turned into an intense affair. Earl was charming, impulsive, willing to do anything Nikki asked of him, and Nikki knew how to manipulate him. On December 9th, they decided together that Chad had to die. Not sometime, but soon. The details were still vague, but the goal was clear. Nikki said she would never be free as long as he was alive. Earl said nothing. He knew what that meant, and that there would be no turning back. What they didn't realize that night was that every step they took would later be meticulously reconstructed. Every conversation, every shared glance, every message would be used against them, but at that moment they felt safe, untouchable. In the days after their decision, they began their preparations. Nikki checked into a hotel. She explained that the house was too cold. Chad stayed behind alone, unaware that his wife was no longer his wife, that she had already said goodbye in her mind, and that their love would not end in tears, but in fire. On December 30th, 2019, at 5:05 a.m., an emergency call came in. There was a fire on Burlington Drive, a single-family home, flames on the ground floor. When the fire department arrived, they were met with a horrific scene: charred furniture, thick smoke, and a lifeless body in the back of the house. The police were called immediately. It quickly became clear that this was no ordinary fire. It took the fire department almost 2 hours to bring the flames under control. When the smoke cleared, a scene of destruction remained. Charred walls, blackened ceilings, the typical smell of burnt plastic and wood, and a body discovered in one of the back rooms. The body was partially burned, lying on its back, barely identifiable. But initial investigations quickly revealed that it was Chad Ensel, 42 years old, a resident of the house. But something was wrong. The position of the body, the extent of the burns, the condition of the furniture, all pointed to the fire not being the cause of death. Even before the body was autopsied, the firefighters were certain. The fire had been set deliberately. When forensic investigators examined the room, they found suspicious evidence. Several cigarettes were scattered around the living room, and a portable fan heater had been positioned in close proximity to flammable materials. In the kitchen, there were open bottles of alcohol arranged in a way that appeared deliberate. The smoke detectors had been removed. The investigators became suspicious. Why would Chad Ensel, who was known for his tidiness and reserve, leave cigarettes lying around, drink alcohol, and position heating appliances in such a dangerous way? It didn't fit the picture, and it certainly didn't fit his usual lifestyle. The police tried to contact Nikki Ensel. She called back in the late afternoon from a hotel in another part of town. Her voice sounded calm, almost too calm. She said she needed a few days away, that there had been an argument, that she knew nothing about the fire and only found out about it when she received a phone call. But when she later came to the police, her answers seemed mechanical. She repeated several times that he had been acting strangely lately, that he had been going through a depressive phase. The investigators noted no tears, no emotions, no questions about the condition of the house or the circumstances of the death. Nikki Ensel seemed distant and cold. Initial suspicions began to form. Nothing had been proven yet, But one thing was clear. This fire was no accident, and Chad Ensel had not simply died in his sleep. Someone had killed him, and the fire was just a smokescreen to hide the truth. On December 31st, Chad Ensel's body was autopsied at the Bismarck Medical Examiner's office. The forensic results left no room for doubt. 2 gunshot wounds, one in the back, one in the head, both fatal. And there was another crucial detail. There was no soot in his lungs. This meant that Chad was already dead before the fire broke out. With this finding, the case was finally reclassified from a suspicious fire to intentional murder. The staging as an accident or even suicide had failed. Instead, there was now suspicion that someone had deliberately tried to destroy evidence, and the list of people with access to the house was short. The investigators focused again on Nikki Ensel. She had made contradictory statements, had not been in the house on the night of the crime, and had behaved conspicuously calmly. When she appeared for further questioning, she suddenly presented a new version of events. Chad had been drinking heavily lately. He had been unpredictable. She had been afraid. That was why she had withdrawn. This explanation did not match the statements of former acquaintances or colleagues. Chad was considered reliable, quiet, never aggressive. There had been no police calls, no known incidents of domestic violence. The new account seemed contrived, an attempt to shift the motive. Then the investigators came across a name that Nikki had not mentioned before, Earl Howard. A package in the house was addressed to him. What's more, the hotel room where Nikki had been staying for several days had been registered in his name, and there were joint payments on her credit card statement. It quickly became clear that the two were connected by more than just an acquaintance. Nikki was confronted with the discovery. At first, she denied knowing Earl Howard. Then she admitted that yes, they had had an affair. But Chad had known about it. It had all been complicated. For the investigators, this was more than just a fling. It was a possible motive for the crime, and perhaps the crucial clue to a second perpetrator. Because if Nikki wasn't alone when she lied, then Earl Howard could be the key to the truth. On January 1st, 2020, an arrest warrant was issued for Earl, but the man had disappeared. Earl Howard was arrested on January 2nd, 2020, in the small town of South St. Paul, Minnesota, after a search lasting several hours and an anonymous tip. He had spent the night in a motel, apparently alone. In his luggage, clothes, cash, a cell phone, and a note with a list of things that needed to be taken care of. One of the items on the list was calm Nikki down. During his initial interrogation, Howard was calm, composed, and downright sober. He did not outright deny the crime, but he was evasive. He only said he wanted to speak to a lawyer. But what he didn't know was that investigators had long since accessed his cell phone and location data. And these clearly showed that on the evening of December 29th, Howard had been in a vehicle near the Ensel home. He had been there several times. And, even more damning, he was at the scene on the night of the fire. At the same time, Nikki Ensel was summoned again. Now confronted with the location data and hotel bookings, she came under pressure. She changed her statement again. Now she claimed that she had not asked Earl to do anything. On the contrary, she had been shocked when she found out that Chad was dead. But this version did not hold up for long either, because Howard started talking. In a comprehensive confession, he admitted to having planned the murder together with Nikki. Days earlier, they had discussed ways to get Chad out of the way. Nikki had told him that Chad was violent and that she needed to protect herself, but Earl also admitted that he didn't see who pulled the trigger. Nikki had called him and told him to come over. When he arrived, Chad was already dead, at least according to his version of events. But there were many indications that he knew more than he was admitting. He knew details about the crime scene that had not been made public. He talked about the placement of the cigarettes, the space heater, the sequence of events that night, things that only someone involved could know. The investigators were now faced with a classic dilemma. Two perpetrators, two versions. Both shifted the blame onto each other. But one thing was clear. They were jointly responsible. And each of their contradictions tightened the noose. On January 3rd, both Nikki and Earl were charged with second-degree murder, arson, and destruction of evidence. Their story, a story of affair, manipulation, and murder, now began to unravel piece by piece. With the double indictment of Nikki Ensel and Earl Howard, public attention began to grow rapidly. The local press, but also national media, now followed the case daily. Because what was emerging here was more than a marital drama. It was a calculated murder with cold-blooded planning, committed by a woman who had previously been considered a caring mother and wife. In the weeks that followed, investigators analyzed hundreds of messages between Nikki and Earl. These included chat histories, voice messages, and emails. The tone was clear. This was not just about love or an affair. It was about control, money, and a new life. In several messages, Nikki said she wanted to be free at last, that Chad was blocking her, that she deserved everything he had. Particularly damning was a message sent 2 days before the murder. "We can do this. After that, we'll be together. Forever." While Earl Howard cooperated in custody and repeatedly tried to portray himself as a follower, Nikki behaved completely differently. In prison, she was considered calm, almost demonstratively composed. She avoided other inmates, wrote notes, and appeared focused. Her lawyers began to build a defense strategy based on psychological stress and domestic violence. But this narrative quickly reached its limits. No one in his circle could confirm that Chad Ensel had ever been aggressive. There were no previous reports, no medical reports, no indications of escalation. On the contrary, friends described him as reserved, almost conflict-averse. Investigators saw Nikki's statements as a deliberate attempt to gain control over the narrative, after the fact and tactically. One official later said, "She didn't seem like a woman who was afraid. She seemed like someone who wanted to be in control." The public reaction was divided. Some thought it was conceivable that Nikki had acted under pressure. Others saw her as a master manipulator. Online forums speculated whether she had unconsciously used Howard or whether she had deliberately pulled the strings and was prepared to drop him if necessary. When the trial was scheduled for 2022, it was clear that this would not be an easy case. Not only the crime itself, but also the personalities of the perpetrators would be at the center of attention. The trial against Nikki Ensel began in the spring of 2022 in Burleigh County District Court. The prosecution presented a complete picture: joint planning, emotional and financial motives, manipulative communication, and a deliberate staging to make the murder look like an accident or suicide. It was not a crime of passion. It was cold and systematic. During the trial, Earl Howard testified against Nikki again. He described in detail their conversations, her instructions, and her reaction after the murder. He admitted to setting the fire at her request to make everything go away. Nikki, on the other hand, stuck to her story. She said she wasn't there, knew nothing about it, and that Earl acted alone. But the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic reports proved that Chad was already dead when the fire broke out. The placement of the space heater, the open alcohol bottles, the scattered cigarettes, everything looked staged. A forensic technician testified, "This was not a spontaneous act. This was a carefully planned crime scene." Particularly striking was a video clip from the police interview in which Nikki Ensel said with a blank stare, "I just wanted it to be over." At the end of the trial, Nikki Ensel was found guilty on all counts: second-degree murder, arson, and destruction of evidence. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of early release. Earl Howard, who had cooperated fully, received 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for the first 15 years. In its ruling, the court referred to a dangerous duo and a despicable abuse of trust and intimacy. For Chad and Nikki Ensel's children, a world lay in ruins. Their father was dead, their mother a convicted murderer. Their grandparents took custody. The school organized psychological help, and the community collected donations. A former friend of Chad summed up the case in an interview. He hadn't done anything to anyone. He just wanted to love and be loved.